Hey guys, it is I, Kuroninja. Ninja Sentai Kakuranger is celebrating its 30-year anniversary, and this season has been very influential to me. In fact, my very first video on this channel was a brief summary of Ninja Sentai Kakuranger. So I thought, why not celebrate this milestone by rewatching every episode of the season? My channel has evolved a lot since I first started. I wanted to see what I think of the show now compared to when I was just beginning, but I've thought of it and I realized it'll take a long time to watch every episode. So I'm going to be breaking it down into different arcs, and then when I finish watching every episode, I'll try to upload the full thing as a compilation of all the parts. This first video will be looking at episodes 1 to 12, and with that out of the way, let's begin. Episode 1 starts with some exposition given to us by the narrator, whose appearance reminded me of rakugo, a style of Japanese comedy. In fact, the one who portrayed the narrator in Kakuranger was a rakugo performer. I know what rakugo is, but it's not something I'm deeply familiar with, so I won't go into detail about it. What this does show is that Kakuranger will be a lighthearted Sentai season, at least in the beginning. Anyway, the exposition shows that a long time ago, 5 ninjas fought the leader of the yokai, Nurari-hyon, and sealed him away in the Door of Seals. Then the narrator introduces us to Sasuke and Saizo, whose names are based on 2 legendary ninjas from Japanese folklore, Sarutobi Sasuke and Kirigakure Saizo. The 2 of them are arguing over what to eat when they see someone getting beaten up. They save the guy who tells them to deliver a bag of money to the shrine on Kappa Inari Island. On the island, Sasuke and Saizo end up getting lost in a forest, but little do they know they're being watched. Then they get attacked by ninjas and end up near a large door, which turns out to be the Door of Seals. After accidentally opening it, it's revealed that this was all a trick by the yokai Kappa, and the money in the bag turned out to be cucumbers. We also get introduced to Sandayu, who tells the 2 that they have just released all the yokai's energy back into the world. The episode continues with us getting introduced to even more yokai, and then they see this large castle in the distance. This is where the 2 of them are introduced to Tsuruhime, and we later find out that they're the descendants of the ninjas who fought against the yokai before. The descendants then give Sasuke, Saizo, and Tsuruhime their Doron changers, which they will use to transform into Sentai Rangers. Now, one thing you've probably heard about me is that I'm not a fan of Red Rangers in Super Sentai. The reason why is because the Red Rangers are the ones who get most of the spotlight. But this season makes it clear that Tsuruhime, the White Ranger, is the leader of the Kakurangers. During the first team pose, she is the one standing in the middle. She also fights better than Sasuke and Saizo, the Red and Blue Rangers of the team. Another thing about Kakuranger is that it borrows a lot of inspiration from comic books, as shown during the fight sequences. The monsters of the week also have absurd attacks sometimes, like Kappa in this episode, who defeats Ninja Red and Ninja Blue with an explosive football. The episode ends with it looking like the Kakurangers are about to have a standoff with Kappa, but then another yokai, who turns out to be his wife, appears to carry him to safety. Now, before we move on to episode 2, you might have noticed that the Yellow Ranger and Black Ranger have yet to be introduced. A lot of people have noticed that recent seasons of Super Sentai, starting with Zenkaiger, have introduced the Rangers one by one, having them gradually join the team rather than have all the core team members join at the same time in the first episode. This is a good idea because it lets us get to know each of the individual Rangers a bit more, but it also prevents the Red Ranger from stealing the spotlight. In this episode, the Kakurangers are tasked with finding their next member, Seikai, at an arcade while Tsuruhime gets a present from Sandayu. This is a continuation from last episode where Kappa's wife, later revealed to be Rokurokubi, is the yokai that this episode focuses on. I noticed that starting out, Sasuke and Saizo aren't very cooperative with Tsuruhime, since they're still getting used to their duty as Kakurangers. Now, the villain of the week, like I said, is Rokurokubi, whose human form is the manager of an arcade. In this arcade, Seikai and who I think is his brother are playing games, but then they're separated by the yokai who thinks that Seikai's brother is her long-lost son. But according to Kappa, her son was killed by the humans, and this isn't the first time something like this has happened. This episode establishes Seikai as someone who likes playing video games, and he's also a bit of a ladies' man. Meanwhile, 2 things are introduced by Sandayu. The first is that the Kakurangers have a new mode of transport, Nekomaru, a cat spirit in the form of a food truck. The second is that there's this big cloud in the sky yokai that's supposed to be a large gathering of humanity's negative energy. Anyway, the Kakurangers find Seikai in the arcade and they use Nekomaru to bring him to the empty field from last episode so he can get his power. But Sasuke stays behind to fight off Kappa and Roku Rokubi, and the two of them grow big by absorbing the negative energy. This is how the monsters of the week in Kakuranger grow. Ninja Red then finds the power to transform into a giant fighter and uses it to defeat the two yokai. This is a good episode, and I think it did a better job of introducing our Yellow Ranger than episode 1 did of introducing Sasuke and Saizo. Even though he's not my favorite member of the Kakurangers, I still think Seikai is a good character, even though one of his best moments is yet to happen. Now, before I go on to the next episode, I'd like to point out two interesting side notes I got when rewatching this episode. When Seikai meets his ancestor, Miyoshi Seikai, not to be confused with Miyoshi Mutsumi, Seikai's ancestor tells him to be wary of the kunoichi. This could be a throwaway line pointing out how Seikai is a ladies' man, but upon rewatching, this line could also be foreshadowing events that'll happen later on. Or maybe he doesn't actually say that and the subs were wrong. Another thing I'd like to point out is that there's something I didn't notice about Roku Rokubi's design until now. Roku Rokubi's face that you see in the front, the one with the sunglasses, is not actually her real face. It's a facade. If you look closely enough, her real eyes are on her cheeks and her real mouth is below her jaw. Just something I think you'll find interesting. Episode 3 is the introduction of one of my favorite characters in the series. It also introduces us to the Kakurangers' crepe stand, which is how they make a living while fighting yokai. The yokai of the week for this episode is Oboro Guruma, who takes the form of a taxi driver. A lot of yokai in this series want to attack humans, but for this one in particular, you can kind of understand why. So it's even more surprising for him when he's fighting against the Kakurangers, and then a human dressed as a cowboy comes to his defense. This new character is Jiraiya, the fifth and final member of the Kakurangers and my favorite member of the team. One notable thing about Jiraiya is that in his debut, he mostly speaks English instead of Japanese, so his teammates have a hard time understanding him. The reason why is because he spent most of his time in America before he came to Japan. Jiraiya's character is meant to represent the Japanese people who emigrated to other countries, such as the United States. In fact, Ken Kosugi, the one who portrays Jiraiya in the show, was born in the USA. Anyway, the other Kakurangers don't trust Jiraiya at first, but then he sends them a message telling them of his plan. It turns out that Jiraiya was planning to gain the trust of the yokai so he could infiltrate the base of their boss, Azuki Arai, and retrieve 4 scrolls that will allow the rest of the Kakurangers to join Ninja Red and get their own giant forms. But it turns out to be a trap because Azuki Arai knows what Jiraiya and his clan were doing in America. Oboro Guruma also tries to attack Jiraiya because he's angry that he betrayed him. Fortunately, the Kakurangers are able to find him and he gets the power to transform into Ninja Black. This is where we learn 2 things about our 5th and final ranger. Jiraiya is a bit of a show-off and he also likes working alone. I'm starting to understand why he's my favorite member of the Kakurangers. With Ninja Black and the scrolls on the team, the Kakurangers are able to use their power to defeat Oboro Guruma in quick fashion, but they still have to deal with Azuki Arai. Overall, this was a really great episode. It introduced my favorite ranger in the series, and I can't wait to see what happens in the next episode. So far, I've noticed that episodes 3 and 4 are a 2-parter, just like episodes 1 and 2. I think episodes 5 and 6 are also 2-parters, but we'll talk about that when we get there. Continuing off from last time, the monster of the week in this episode is Azuki Arai. One thing I forgot to mention in the last episode is that in his human form, he's dressed in a police uniform. This episode also shows that in addition to being a ladies' man, Seikai also eats a lot. The story with this episode is that Seikai ends up getting arrested for jaywalking, and then he and Saizo end up in this police chase. Then it's revealed that the police station was taken over by the yokai. Sasuke, the only one who hasn't been captured by Azuki Arai, infiltrates the base and frees the Kakurangers. Now, the Kakurangers have already used a lot of ninja techniques, but this episode is where they start going all out. Sasuke uses his ninjutsu to turn himself into a fly and then a yokai clown. He then uses other techniques such as a cloning technique. There's also some other stuff such as Azuki Arai trying to get away on a bike, only for Ninja Blue to turn himself into a truck. And then Azuki Arai turning himself into a baseball, only to be taken down by Ninja Yellow and Ninja Black, who defeat him with baseball equipment. What makes this episode relevant is that it's the first time the Kakurangers combine to form Muteki Shogun. Muteki Shogun is the first of 3 mecha that the Kakurangers will use. I will talk about the other 2 when they're introduced. The one thing that's notable about Muteki Shogun is that he has a flaming sword that he uses as a finisher. Anyway, this was a good episode even if some parts haven't aged well, such as the penalty for jaywalking, but it's still enjoyable to watch because of the unique action sequences in the first appearance of Muteki Shogun. I think this is where the focus starts to drift away from the main plot. Let's see if episode 5 can hold up. This episode is focused on Saizo, the Blue Ranger of the team. I didn't really remember him that much before I started rewatching, but from this episode and what I remember, it seems like he's the kind of guy who gets himself in a lot of sticky situations. The episode begins with him being too poor to buy a suit, but after saving a kid from being reincarnated into the hero of another world, Saizo ends up dropping his wallet. However, he and the kid are then transported into a maze by 2 yokai who are placing bets on who makes it out the maze first. Now, the 2 yokai in this episode and the next are Nurikabe and Mokumokuren. Nurikabe takes the form of a guy in a coat while Mokumokuren has sunglasses and a hat. Nurikabe seems to be more impulsive with the way he speaks compared to Mokumokuren, who is more patient and speaks slower. This episode focuses more on Nurikabe, and it makes sense that the plot for this episode involves a maze, because the Nurikabe is a yokai that blocks people from moving. At first this seems to be just a minor inconvenience for Saizo, but then the maze gets deadly with traps and walls appearing out of nowhere. Saizo can't even use the door on changer. Eventually, Saizo finds the exit, and Mokumokuren gives him a gold coin as a reward for helping him win his bet. But Nurikabe is a bit salty that he lost and goes to the maze to attack the kid, who he was betting on to escape the maze first. Saizo rushes back into the maze to save the kid, but this time as Ninja Blue. Unlike last time, Ninja Blue has access to his weapons and uses them to break through the walls, making it easier. Now, there's not as much to talk about as the last episodes. One thing that caught my attention was during the fight scene, where the Kakurangers fought against Nurikabe. I mentioned in the last episode how it played into the fun, light-hearted tone of the season with weird ninja techniques. During this fight, the Kakurangers were using more traditional ninja weapons and didn't rely on their more outlandish techniques. I did some digging and found out that episodes 3 and 4 and episodes 5 and 6 were worked on by different directors, so that might have had something to do with it. The giant battle only had Ninja Blue become giant and fight Nurikabe all by himself. Ninja Blue also destroyed the yokai's house, including the maze, but just when it looks like Nurikabe is about to be defeated, a giant eye in the sky appears and stops everything. It looks like in the next episode, the 2 yokai are gonna try and get their revenge. The episode begins with the yokai from last episode robbing a jewelry store as part of their plan to defeat the Kakurangers. And to do it, they're targeting Tsuruhime. Tsuruhime herself starts having these Cinderella-esque dreams where she meets a prince who is giving her the jewelry. But when she wakes up, it turns out that the jewelry was real. The Kakurangers then find out that the jewelry was stolen and the dreams of meeting a prince were actually an illusion created by Mokumokuren. Tsuruhime ends up getting tricked into marrying Mokumokuren, but the Kakurangers are able to find her and defeat both Nurikabe and Mokumokuren. This episode is supposed to be a Tsuruhime-focused episode, but there wasn't that much we learned about Tsuruhime other than the fact that she has a lot of money. Episode 6 was also a bit more slow-paced than the last episode. It wasn't until the end that I found it interesting. So far, episode 6 seems to be the weakest episode in the season, which is a shame since Tsuruhime is one of my favorite Sentai Rangers. What I like about Tsuruhime is that she's the leader of her team, despite not being the Red Ranger, but this episode doesn't really go into depth that much on her character. I'm guessing it's because her role as the team leader is already known by the time we get into episode 6. Then again, it's only the beginning of the season, it won't be until much later that we get to see more of Tsuruhime's character. Episode 7 seems to be a Seikai-focused episode, but it also focuses on Tsuruhime, and it does a way better job than episode 6 in my opinion. It starts with the Kakurangers training, but Seikai is having a picnic by himself instead. He then goes to a restaurant which gets attacked by this episode's yokai, Gakitsuki. The Kakurangers fight off Gakitsuki, who then shrinks down and enters Seikai's body. Now what happens next is that Seikai turns into a giant who can't stop eating thanks to Gakitsuki using his body. The Kakurangers try to get him out of there, but none of their plans seem to work. Seikai then has an idea of having Tsuruhime turn into food to lure Gakitsuki out, but Tsuruhime doesn't want to go with it because she sees Seikai as having no willpower. But she changes her mind though after seeing Seikai attempting to force the yokai out of his body. Tsuruhime turns into a hamburger, and Gakitsuki tries to get Seikai to eat the hamburger, but he manages to resist long enough. The Kakurangers then defeat the yokai and all is well. This episode focuses on the dynamic between Seikai and Tsuruhime, and it not only shows the dynamic between the two, but it also shows Seikai's reason for being on the team. As shown by this episode, Seikai seems to be a slacker who only focuses on food and women. When it really mattered, he was able to resist temptation long enough to stop Gakitsuki from controlling him. Tsuruhime also learned to put more trust into Seikai, even if he's not the most hardworking member of the Kakurangers. This episode also had the first appearance of individual sword finishers, which were used by Ninja White and Ninja Yellow to defeat the yokai. Also, the Dorodoros didn't appear. I know I said I was gonna rewatch every episode of Kakuranger, but I've watched episode 8 so many times I almost have a photographic memory of this episode in particular. It's a Sasuke-focused episode, and the yokai in this episode, Bakeneko, is one of my favorite yokai in Kakuranger based only on her human form. Anyway, in this episode, the Kakurangers notice that Nekomaru is acting weird, and then they stumble across a house owned by a beautiful woman. She offers the Kakurangers a nice meal, but it turns out the food was poisoned, and she was the yokai Bakeneko the whole time. The only one who isn't affected by the poison, besides Tsuruhime, is Sasuke, who only pretended to eat the food. After tracking down Bakeneko to her shop, the Kakurangers rescue the captured kids who were trapped inside because the shop was actually a front for a yokai restaurant, and then they defeat her with the help of Nekomaru. I think this episode is alright. The only criticism I have about this episode is that Bakeneko's human form should have appeared more. Once again, it's time for another episode focused on my favorite member of the Kakurangers. In this episode, Jiraiya gets addicted to samurai films, but at the same time, the yokai Dorotabo wants to appear on TV and become famous, so he starts hijacking news reports and documentaries. As the Kakurangers fight him, Dorotabo starts attacking people with mud balls, injuring a guy who wanted to go on a quiz show with his daughter so they could win a trip overseas. Jiraiya decides to go on the quiz show in his place and answers all the questions correctly, becoming the champion. This attracts the attention of Dorotabo, and the two of them fight in 3 rounds. The first is a martial arts match, the second is a sword fight, and the third round is a boxing match. Jiraiya unsurprisingly wins all 3 rounds, so Dorotabo grows big and the Kakurangers defeat him with Muteki Shogun. Now, one thing I got in my notes was that Jiraiya started speaking Japanese a lot more in this episode, even if he still says some stuff in English. This could be from watching a lot of samurai movies, but it also shows how he's becoming closer with his team. The ending shows that Jiraiya has gotten into professional wrestling, and I'm only bringing this up because I'm also a professional wrestling fan. The plot of Jiraiya being addicted to TV doesn't get resolved by the end of this episode, but I don't care because I thought this episode was fun. I was not looking forward to watching episode 10. It was one of the episodes I didn't like before. The yokai in this episode, Konaki Jiji, is a yokai who looks like a baby with the face of an old man, but when someone picks it up, it turns into a heavy rock and crushes them to death. But I found the Konaki Jiji and Kakuranger too creepy, so I couldn't finish this episode the first time. Anyway, Konaki Jiji is presented as a tragic villain. He's a store owner who wishes to have a family of his own, so he disguises himself as a baby and steals people's souls, which he puts into the dolls in his store. The Kakurangers try to catch him but fail, so they have a plan to stop him by disguising one of their members as a baby, and the one who has to do it is Sasuke. He then gets captured by Dorodoros disguised as a football team and brought to Konaki Jiji's shop. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is that the store owned by Konaki Jiji is called Neverland. You probably recognize it as the name of the island from Peter Pan, where children never grow up. This could be a reference to the yokai himself. In the background of the store, I noticed a painting that looked familiar, and that painting is called called Saturn Devouring His Son, painted by Francisco Goya. I don't think there's any deep meaning behind the inclusion of this painting, but I think it's still worth pointing out. Anyway, after Konaki Jiji reveals his new family to Sasuke, the Red Ranger secretly sends a message before getting put in the fake stroller he was in a while ago. Konaki Jiji plans to send Sasuke rolling down the stairs into a barrel of explosives. The other Kaku Rangers are too late to save him. He manages to escape the ropes using a rope escape technique. Then they defeat Konaki Jiji and everyone's souls are returned. Even though I wasn't excited to watch this episode again, by the end I realized this wasn't the worst episode of a tokusatsu I've seen that had a Konaki Jiji themed monster of the week. I remembered watching an episode of Power Rangers Super Ninja Steel called Sheriff Skyfire, and to call that episode flaming hot garbage would be a massive understatement to how unwatchable it got at certain times. I almost didn't watch this episode, but then I remembered Sheriff Skyfire, and it gave me the motivation I needed to watch Kakuranger episode 10 through to the end. Another thing I like to point out is that this is the first time the Kakurangers used the ninja ball as a finisher. This episode is weird, but it's still decent. The episode starts by introducing the yokai of the week, Shiro Uneri. He's upset at people for having new clothes and goes on a rampage to turn everyone's clothes into rags. As for the Kaku Rangers, they're having Tsuruhime do everyone's laundry, but Seikai decides to help her. It seems like he's into recycling, but that's because he has a crush on this girl who works at a flea market. So when everyone's taking a nap, he steals their clothes and sells them at a flea market, but not before getting caught by the other Kaku Rangers. Anyway, this leads into Shiro Uneri attacking the flea market and kidnapping the girl that Seikai has a crush on because he wants to stop people from recycling clothes, which prevents them from turning into rags. The Kaku Rangers face off against Shiro Uneri and defeat him with a Kaku Ranger ball and Muteki Shogun. But unfortunately, Seikai's crush has to leave to do volunteer work abroad, so Seikai is still alone. One thing I noticed from watching these early episodes is that there seems to be a lot of experimentation with the Kaku Rangers moves. This episode had a lot of substitution ninjutsu involved. It also had this attack where the Kaku Rangers formed a pyramid and then hit the yokai with a series of jumping attacks. So far, the Kaku Rangers have been fighting against yokai who are attacking people by themselves, usually for petty reasons or their own personal gain, but they have yet to fight someone who actually poses a major threat. In the next episode though, things are gonna get more interesting. Episode 12 begins with Dorodoros dressed as clowns trapping kids inside a boulder. The boulder is then brought to a lab that belongs to Dr. Yugami and the yokai in this episode, Tengu, the first yokai in this season without a human form. Tengu wants to be acknowledged as the strongest yokai, so he devised a plan to defeat the Kaku Rangers. Anyway, the Kaku Rangers come across this strange town where the people are acting weird. This leads them to a quarry, but it turns out to be a trap from Tengu and Dr. Yugami. Dr. Yugami then reveals that he has created replicas of the yokai that the Kaku Rangers have fought before, and those yokai are Kappa, Oboroguruma, Azuki Arai, Nurikabe, and Moku Moku Ren. It's very clear that Tengu is stronger than any other yokai. In fact, he and the replica yokai already grow giant before the Kaku Rangers manage to land a hit on them. It looks like the Kaku Rangers are doing better in the giant fight, but then it's revealed that Tengu and Dr. Yugami created the replica yokai from the captured children. The Kaku Rangers are then defeated and forced out of their transformations. Now it looks like the end for the Kaku Rangers, but then they reveal a new power, the Jusho Fighters. These new mechas can fight on their own, and they're also faster and more agile than the Beast Generals. With the help of the Jusho Fighters, the Kaku Rangers defeat Tengu and the replica yokai are also defeated, returning the kids to normal. However, Dr. Yugami has escaped, and it looks like he'll become a recurring foe that the Kaku Rangers will have to face. When watching a series of Super Sentai, there's something I noticed that I call the 12-episode rule. Things tend to get more interesting within the 12-episode mark of a Sentai season, and it even works with Kaku Ranger. Some people like to make judgments of a series right away after only episode 1. We have to be patient. This was the first episode where the yokai posed a major threat to the Kaku Rangers, that they needed a new power-up to defeat them. But the episodes that come after will show you why Kaku Ranger is one of my favorite seasons in Super Sentai. Before watching Kakuranger, I was watching the latest series at the time, Osama Sentai Kakuranger, the 47th season of Super Sentai. It is a highly acclaimed season on par with Gokaiger. Here's the thing though, a lot of people including myself watched King Oger in real time, week by week, as the series was airing. King Oger is liked for its story, but the story had to be stretched across 50 episodes, so even though it was worth it in the end, watching King Oger during the second half felt like a chore at times. I'm bringing this up because a lot of people say that they don't like Kakuranger because a lot of the episodes are filler. If you only wanted to watch the episodes that focused on the main story, you could skip a lot of the episodes and not miss anything. But I see Kakuranger like a bowl of gyudon. The beef has all the flavor, but the rice is just as important. Without the rice, it's not a gyudon, it's just a few thin strips of beef and some onions. And that doesn't sound like a nice meal, doesn't it? Some of the best episodes of Kakuranger, in my opinion, are not that important to the main story, but they're still my favorite episodes, and I will talk about them as we continue this review. But for now, that is all. If you enjoyed, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and remember, I have nothing to do with Kuroninja.